Inspired by successful revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, thousands of demonstrators take to the streets of other Middle Eastern countries, demanding change. So, have the pro-democracy protests galvanized public opinion in the wider Arab world? And how nervous are their leaders as people power begins to spread? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Darren Jordan. As the dust settles on the streets of Egypt, the desire for change is spreading throughout the region. People right across the Arab world say they are angered by unemployment, rampant corruption and social injustice. But while some governments try to buy off public dissent, will that be enough to keep angry people off the streets? Zainab Walji has more.
Revolution is in the air and Arab governments across the region are nervous. What started as an angry reaction to a hike in food prices and high unemployment in Tunisia soon turned into mass protests. Tens of thousands took to the streets, first asking for new economic policies, then demanding the removal of the regime. And after 3 weeks of protest, the 23-year rule of Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali came to an end. For the first time in Arab history, a dictator was toppled. He fled his country and was exiled to Saudi Arabia. And it's Tunisia's uprising that has inspired the disenfranchised in Egypt. On the 25th of January, growing frustration among Egyptian youth spilled onto the streets. They had one demand: Hosni Mubarak must step down. For 18 days, undeterred by violence, they protested. Their numbers growing by the day, they fought through Mubarak's stubborn reluctance to leave. And on Friday, the 11th of February, the regime that had dominated Egyptian politics for 30 years was finally ousted, and Mubarak stepped down.
President Mohammed Hosni Mubarak has decided to waive the office of the President of the Republic.
The announcement was met with jubilation across the country. This hunger for political change is spreading, and the Arab regimes are taking note. In Yemen, President Ali Abdullah Saleh has promised not to run again.
There's no extension, no inheritance, no resetting the clock, as some have repeatedly claimed.
But after 30 years in power, did these concessions come too late? Police in Yemen's capital Sana'a clashed with several thousand anti-government protesters on Sunday, staging a third consecutive day of demonstrations. As in Egypt, they're calling for political reforms and the resignation of their long-serving president. In Bahrain, the kingdom's leaders have promised to expand media freedoms and increase social spending. But Shia-led opposition groups and others have joined calls for demonstrations on Monday. The Algerian government has said it will lift 19 years of emergency rule within days. But across the weekend, thousands took to the streets of Algiers defying a police ban. They have vowed to protest every Saturday until President Bouteflika steps down. In Jordan, King Abdullah swore in a new cabinet, and in Morocco, mass protests are planned for next week. Governments in the region are undoubtedly nervous by this ongoing trend. But will these governments face the same fate as Egypt and Tunisia? Zainab Walji, Inside Story.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our guests from Amman, Lamis Andoni, political commentator and writer. Lamis has covered the Middle East region for 20 years as a freelance journalist. From Jeddah, Anwar Eshki, director and founder of the Middle East Center for Strategic Studies, a Jeddah-based think tank. And from Beirut, Paul Salem, director of the Carnegie Middle East Center. Welcome to the program. Paul Salem in Beirut, let me start with you, if I may. All the experts spoke of contagion, that the fallout from the protests in Tunisia and Egypt would spark dissent elsewhere. Is that what we're seeing now, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, the contagion is obvious from Tunisia to Egypt, from Egypt to Morocco, Algeria, Jordan, Yemen, even Iran. The fact that these demonstrations were citizens' demonstrations, the fact that they were covered live on television, particularly on Jazeera Arabic television, meant that these were events very evocative, very emotional, that every Arab citizen was watching live in their living room. So what happened to in Tunisia, Bouazizi starting there, and then what happened in Egypt has really changed sort of the psychology of the Arab citizen, changed the balance of power in all the Arab countries. The citizens now believe that they actually can achieve change. I don't think we believed that 3 months ago. The regimes which thought that they were secure, most of them realized that in the face of widespread public uprisings, they can barely hold on for a few weeks. And the international community has realized that these regimes that it was allied with are precarious. Also that the uprisings are not necessarily Islamist, but rather citizens, pro-democracy demonstrations, all of which brand new conditions for the Arab world. I think this is certainly a very positive, very historic moment for the Arab world. Of course, every Arab country has different conditions. From Morocco to Yemen, each one has their own story. But they're going through very similar challenges.
All right, let's bring in Anwar Eshki in Jeddah, if we can. Anwar Eshki, why didn't these regimes that have been toppled see this coming? I mean, Mubarak ruled for nearly 30 years. He was forced to step down in just under 3 weeks. I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes. If we know exactly, every time when the international system has been changed, that will be reflected for the form of the countries. After Russia devastation, what happened? Happened that the world divided to 3 systems. One system, totalitarian system, that in Russia, and the liberal system in the United States and Europe, and the authoritarian system in the Middle East. And after the devastation of Russia, they changed. They changed in the Eastern Europe and Asian Western, and now that come to the Middle East, because the Middle East has been many problems. For that reason, that started here. And also, when the material of production changed, that happened.
Okay.
Are you with me?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
No. Let's bring in Lamis. Let's just bring in Lamis Andoni in Amman for a second. I mean, Lamis, what do you think are the main factors throughout the region that people have been angry about? I mean, is it autocracy, as Anwar Eshki seems to suggest? Is it corruption, unemployment? Why are people so angry?
Well, absence of democracy, repression, suppression of freedom of expression and of political freedoms, economic policies that drove people towards poverty and unemployment. People felt humiliated and marginalized by systems, by coercive systems, which denied them economic opportunities and the opportunity and the right to speak and to participate in decision making. All of these factors work together to bring about a revolution in the Arab world.
Paul Salem in Beirut, I mean, what's your assessment of why people have decided to suddenly rise up and carry out these dramatic revolutions? I mean, what's happening in the Arab world?
Well, I mean, one of the questions is, why didn't it happen earlier? Certainly, these conditions have been around for some time. The economic conditions, the repression, the political conditions, and so on. It's possible that the financial crisis of 2008 has made things worse, not better. I do think that the presence in the last few years of the pan-Arab media, the televisions, have been a very big condition, as well as the spread of Facebook and the internet as modes of organization. So I think those combinations taken together kind of created the conditions for the perfect storm, and it only required one spark, which was Bouazizi in Tunisia, for those networks to spring into action. One action led to 10 actions, 10 led to 1,000, and things were out of control. So I think it was the right conditions and a spark that happened to come along. Volcanoes that were awaiting to erupt for years and years. have finally erupted, and they're erupting throughout the region, no doubt.
Well, let me put that question to Anwar Eshki in Jeddah. Anwar Eshki, I mean, why hasn't this happened before? Why have people kept so quiet all this time?
Yeah, because we now in the era of the technology and the era of the connection between the people become very wide, and the Facebook and others can make the people talking together. After that, when the Kifaya started in 2005 until 2008, they didn't make demonstration except 8 times. And after that, in 2008, that the youth of 6 April, they come and collect all other oppositors with them. But they could not to make demonstration more than 400 people. But when they use the Google and others, they can connect with millions. For that reason, they can call for all the millions to make demonstration and protesting.
So you're saying basically that the power of social networking has galvanized the supporters. Let's bring in Lamis Andoni in Iman back again. Lamis, what's the position then in Jordan where you are? I mean, suddenly we've seen King Abdullah announce some reforms. He sacked the government a few weeks ago. He's apparently appeasing the tribes with, we're hearing, some financial support. Is that going to be enough in Jordan, do you think?
No, it's not enough, and the king knows it. For the first time, he has met with the different groups of the opposition, especially the Brotherhood, and he has promised real change. And all of the changes that he made so far are not enough, because we have a parliament that people do not believe in because the elections were flawed. We have laws that people don't believe in, laws that coerce citizens instead of enable citizens and protect the law. They actually coerce even undermine the constitution. So the king would have to cede power in order to have to have broader participation in Jordan, or else the message from the people to the king: we don't want to change the regime, but you have to cede some powers. And this message has been made very clear to the king by opposition figures and by ordinary Jordanians. Okay, you want to stay, you have to stay according to our terms. And this is the first ever time in the Jordanian history that people talk like this with the king, collectively and individually.
Paul Salem in Beirut, I mean, one of the interesting things that came out of these revolutions, both in Tunisia and in Egypt, is that these uprisings have not adhered to any religious ideology. So why have these revolutions succeeded where Islamist movements have failed, do you think?
Well, a number of reasons. I mean, one is, it turns out, maybe it shouldn't have been a surprise, but people care mostly about their rights, their freedoms, their dignity, their economic conditions. Of course, they might be religious, they have religious beliefs that they also care about, but certainly they've proven that they care much more about their basic political, social, and economic rights. It's also the case that appeals to such political, social, and economic rights appeal to everybody, whereas appeals by religious groups only appeal to a religious, religious minority, as it were. So these have been much more effective. I think the fact that, they've also been successful because the government has not been able to repress them in the ways that it's gotten accustomed to repressing Islamist movements, nor could the West react negatively as it has to the Islamist movements before. Well, so a combination of factors.
Let's ask Anwar Eshki in Jeddah that very question. Anwar Eshki, I mean, has the appeal of Islamist groups disappeared, do you think, in these revolutions? I mean, are the Islamists, as Paul Salem is saying, out of touch with economic and social issues with the people on the street?
Yeah, because the demonstration in Egypt and in Arab countries, the Islamic Hood, Muslims Hood in Egypt, they found themselves out of the game because they could not collect all that demonstrator. And also, that they found them, they tried to kidnap that revolution, but they couldn't, and also Al-Ghad and other. For that reason, they found themselves inside of game, but they cannot control for that game. For that reason, we found that people, the youth, when they made their demonstration, they didn't have any program, a political program, or they don't have leaders, and any leader, anyone tried to make himself as a leader for the demonstrators, they refuse him, like Barad'i and others. For that reason, the Islamic Code found themselves, they have to go with all the people, all the demonstrators.
Lamis Andoni, the Islamists seem to have galvanized, perhaps under a very ambiguous slogan that Islam is a solution, but as our other two guests are saying, it's not representative of social and economic grievances, is it? So are they relevant to these uprisings, do you think?
They are still relevant as part of the landscape of the political life in the Arab world. No changes and no renewal of the systems, not renewal, building new systems without the inclusion of the Islamists. They cannot be excluded. But definitely they have failed. What the uprisings have shown is that the Islamists have failed to put forward in a socio-economic platform to express the grievances, socio-economic grievances, and provide solutions for the people that they represent. Secondly, you cannot. They are more exclusivist because, as Paul Salem said, you have to appeal to a wider population. I just want to note something about the media. The media, especially the satellite television, have made the experience collective, meaning that people are watching the Tunisian and the Egyptian revolution and they feel that they are taking part of it, that they are staging their own sit-ins in front of television and struggling with the Egyptians, struggling with the Tunisians, and their hearts are filled with joy and anxiety. And so their victory was the victory of all Arabs. So that empowered people to feel that they could change their own systems.
I just want to bring back Paul Salem into the discussion here. Paul, I want to ask you specifically about Yemen, if I can. It's a country engulfed in crisis. It has a war against the Shia Houthis in the north. There are secessionists in the south. There's endemic corruption. Would mass protests ignite real change, or are the issues too complicated, do you think?
Well, certainly, you know, Yemen is a very, very complicated place going through many, many crises at once. In particular, politically, Yemen has had civil wars before. It's internally not terribly united, unlike Egypt or Tunisia, which as nation states are extremely coherent, and hence the uprising leads to simply a vertical change rather than a disintegration. Countries like Yemen, like Lebanon, like Iraq, like Bahrain, maybe like Syria potentially, have, you know, faced the danger that if, you know, protests escalate, yes, they might lead to a change of the head of state, but that might also lead to disintegration of the state itself. You already have in Yemen secessionists in the south, you have the Houthi movement in the north, you have issues in Hadramaut. So these protests, although people are experiencing them very similarly, might have very different impacts in different Arab countries.
Anwar Eshki in Jeddah, let me ask you about Bahrain. Bahrain is on your doorstep there. This is an interesting example, really, isn't it? Because there are sectarian divisions there. They've been brewing for some time. We have a Sunni minority governed by a Shia majority. The Saudis clearly want to support the Sunni government and are worried, of course, about Iran extending its influence amongst the Shia. So how is this likely to play out? I mean, we're already seeing some protests in Bahrain already.
Yeah, let me tell you about something. The Arab countries divided to three groups. Groups in the Gulf that not exactly will happen that inside of that, because the system there is like tribes system, and their loyalty for the sheikh of a tribe, and also the United States and or Europe, they don't like that happened in these countries, because they have oil, and if anything happens that will be cause problem for all the world. but others will change by the demonstration. And the third, like Sudan, like Syria, they will not change by that.
But what about the situation in Bahrain? What about the situation in Bahrain? That's the question.
About Bahrain, you are right, because the Bahrain, the Shia is more than Sunni, but the government there tried to control for that. But some of Shia influenced by Iran. But Bahrain, she has this trouble, but I don't believe that will be change the power in Bahrain.
Okay, Lamis, let me come back to you. We haven't spoken about the other main Gulf states. We've talked about Bahrain, of course. Countries like Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, the UAE, Saudi Arabia there. These countries have vast oil wealth, as Anwar Eshki just said. Presumably, it's unlikely they'll face a full-scale revolt.
Because the societies are different, especially like in Kuwait, there is an opposition, organized opposition. In other countries, there are not even organized opposition parties. There is no tradition of opposition. In these countries, it depends on how the way the wealth is distributed, because the societies have not reached a stage where there are unions or syndicates. But I think even these leaders would have to make changes in order to bring in more segments of the populations in. The wealth has made it, facilitated the ruling of the leaders of the Gulf, the emirs and the sheikhs and that. But the wealth will be depleted. So there has to be a system in place which include power sharing, or else they will face it not now, but in the future.
Okay, let me put that point.
Dissent and discontent.
Okay, let me put that point. Sorry, Lamis. Let me put that to Paul Salem, because we're slightly running out of time. Paul, what's your take on the richer Gulf states where the oil wealth has seen the economies flourish? Because people in Kuwait, for example, they have issues with democracy and parliamentary reform.
Well, I mean, the oil countries do not have the high levels of unemployment and extreme poverty and illiteracy that you found in Tunisia and Egypt, and that you do find in Morocco, Algeria, Syria, Syria, Jordan, and Yemen. So they have very different social and economic conditions. That doesn't mean that people are happy or that people don't have demands. I expect in the Gulf countries, the big ones and the smaller ones, for some, increased political reform, a bit more participation. Each one is on a different trajectory. Kuwait already has a fairly open system. They might have to offer more concessions. I expect some reforms to take place from the top in Saudi Arabia to accommodate reform voices that we saw a few years ago. Bahrain is a special case, which is really more a case of conflict management and sectarian tension, rather than sort of vertical issues. But the conditions there will not, to my mind, lead to revolt, but to reform.
Okay.
In particular, that all of these countries are monarchies, not republics, and that gives them a different political context.
Anwar Eshki, just very briefly, you touched on a point about the US response to this. I mean, will the Americans seek to avoid any sudden change in these Gulf state monarchies purely in order to prevent disruption of the oil supplies to the world economy, perhaps?
Yes, United States try to avoid for the Gulf countries to make any destabilize in that countries. But also, if we look at Saudi Arabia has special things. Saudi Arabia has the policy of open door that make the government, the people, and the leaders very close. And King Abdullah make the dialogue, the national dialogue in Saudi Arabia. That also help for the people and know each other and know any problem with the Shia and Sunnah, know any problem with any people for another people. And also Saudi Arabia immediately when that problem happened, they come and to make solution for that.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all my guests in Amman, Lamis Andoni, in Jeddah, Anwar Eshki, and in Beirut, Paul Salem. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and your suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team here, goodbye for now.